Just throw away that dusty frame, the realtor insisted, pointing at the faded military photograph on the cafe wall. It's bringing down the property value. The owner shook her head. That photo saved 30 lives in the Pacific. And today, it's about to save this whole town. Marie Sullivan's Harbor Light Cafe had been a fixture in Port Haven, Oregon for 42 years. The small coastal town had seen better days. Fishing industry collapsed, young people moving away, storefronts emptying one by one. Now, with the bank threatening foreclosure, Marie's Cafe was one of the last holdouts on the once-bustling waterfront. The photograph in question hung behind the counter, protected by a simple wooden frame weathered by decades of sea air. It showed a group of sailors standing on a submarine deck, their faces young and serious beneath World War II-era caps. In the background, barely visible, were what looked like Japanese naval vessels on the horizon. Mrs. Sullivan, Jessica Parker, the realtor, adjusted her designer glasses. The development company's offer is more than fair. This whole waterfront is being renovated. Modern restaurants, boutique hotels, tourist attractions. Your establishment doesn't fit the new image. Marie wiped down the counter with practiced movements, her silver hair caught in its usual practical bun. At 73, she had the energy of someone 20 years younger and the stubborn determination that came from keeping a business alive through decades of economic ups and downs. See that man in the center? Marie pointed to the photograph. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, submarine commander. The photo was taken moments before he made a decision that saved not just his crew, but 36 civilians on a missionary boat. Fascinating, Jessica replied, not bothering to look. But sentiment doesn't pay bills. The bank's deadline is tomorrow. Without a miracle, this place will be demolished next week. The morning regulars watched the exchange from their usual seats, retired fishermen, local teachers, the handful of loyal customers who understood that Harbor Light was more than just a cafe. It was the town's living room, its unofficial museum, its heart. Old Joe Matthews, who'd been coming for breakfast every day since 1985, spoke up from his corner booth. Tell her about the code, Marie. Tell her what's really in that picture. Jessica paused, despite herself. Code. Marie's eyes took on a distant look. The ships in the background. Their position specifically. Lieutenant Hayes knew his photograph would be developed by Navy intelligence. He found a way to warn them about something bigger. Something that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Mrs. Sullivan, Jessica sighed, I'm not here for history lessons. I'm here to dash. The cafe door chimed, cutting her off. A tall man in a naval uniform entered, his captain's bars catching the morning light. Behind him, 2 junior officers carried what looked like official documents. Marie Sullivan, the captain asked, though his tone suggested he already knew who she was. I'm Captain Michael Hayes, U.S. Navy Intelligence. We need to talk about my grandfather's photograph. The cafe fell silent. Even the usual clatter of dishes from the kitchen ceased as Danny, Marie's cook for the past 20 years, emerged to listen. Bit late for breakfast, Captain, Marie said calmly, though her hands had stopped their constant movement. Coffee. No time, Hayes replied, spreading documents across the counter. That photograph. We've only just realized what it really shows. What my grandfather hidden in plain sight all these years. Jessica shifted impatiently. I'm in the middle of a business meeting dash. This is a matter of national security, Hayes cut her off. That photograph contains encrypted coordinates that we believe identify the location of something vital to both historical record and current naval operations. Marie nodded slowly. The missing ships. You know about them? Hayes asked sharply. Your grandfather used to come here, Captain. Back when my father ran this place. He'd sit at this very counter, staring at that photo, mumbling about coordinates and bearings. Said someday someone would understand what he'd done. What he'd found. The captain's junior officers had started setting up electronic equipment, scanning the photograph with devices that looked decidedly classified. The cafe's regulars watched with growing interest as history seemed to come alive before their eyes. Mrs. Sullivan, Hayes said quietly, that photograph may be the key to locating 3 Japanese vessels that vanished in 1944. Vessels carrying something the modern Navy very much needs to find. The gold, Marie said simply. The Emperor's payment for the new weapons. Hayes stared at her. How could you possibly know dash? Because your grandfather told my father. Told him to protect this photo, no matter what. Said someday it would matter more than anyone could guess. She turned to Jessica. Still think it's just bringing down property values? The realtor had backed away from the counter, her phone forgotten in her hand, as more naval personnel entered the cafe. Equipment cases were being carried in. Communications gear was being set up. Harbor Light was rapidly transforming into an impromptu military command center. The development company's deadline, Jessica managed, the bank. We'll have to wait, Captain Hayes stated firmly. This cafe just became a temporary naval installation. Mrs. Sullivan, we'll need to set up operations here. Could be days, maybe weeks. Marie smiled for the first time that morning. Well then, Captain, you boys are going to need breakfast. Danny, fire up the grill. Looks like we've got some hungry sailors to feed. As word spread through Port Haven, crowds began gathering outside the cafe windows. Local news vans appeared. People who hadn't set foot in Harbor Light for years found themselves drawn back, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in their dying waterfront. And behind the counter, that faded photograph, dismissed as worthless by developers and banks, began revealing secrets that had waited nearly 8 decades to be discovered. Secrets that would not only save a small-town cafe, but would transform an entire community's understanding of its place in history. What none of them knew yet was that somewhere out in the Pacific, naval vessels were already changing course, responding to emergency orders from the highest levels of command. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't hidden in secret vaults or buried chests, but in plain sight on the walls of small-town cafes, waiting for the right moment to change everything. By noon, Harbor Light Cafe had become the center of an operation that stretched from the Pentagon to the Western Pacific. Naval cryptographers huddled over laptops, analyzing every detail of the photograph that had hung unassumingly on Marie's wall for decades. It's brilliant, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the team's lead analyst, explained to Captain Hayes. Your grandfather used the positions of the sailors as a code. Their stance, the angle of their caps, even the way they're spaced on the deck, it's all part of a coordinate system. Marie moved among the naval personnel, keeping coffee cups filled while absorbing conversations that seemed pulled from a spy novel. Her regular customers had refused to leave, becoming unofficial witnesses to history unfolding. The Japanese ships in the background, Martinez continued, they're not just random vessels. They're specifically positioned to mark boundaries. When overlaid with modern navigational charts. She pulled up a digital map on her screen. They create a perfect triangle. And at its center, the Lost Fleet, Hayes finished. 3 Japanese submarines carrying the Emperor's gold. Intended to pay for weapons that never arrived because the war ended first. Old Joe Matthews spoke up from his corner booth. Lieutenant Hayes, your grandfather, he used to talk about a mission that went wrong. Said he found something he wasn't supposed to find. Hayes turned to the elderly customer. You knew my grandfather? Son, everybody in Port Haven knew Tom Hayes. He'd sit right there at the counter, nursing coffee for hours, staring at that photo like it held all the answers in the world. Marie nodded. He'd draw diagrams on napkins, plotting courses that made no sense to anyone else. My father kept them all. You have more materials? Martinez asked sharply. Marie disappeared into the back room, returning with a battered metal box. Dad never threw anything away. Said Tom Hayes was leaving breadcrumbs for someone smart enough to follow them. The cryptography team fell on the box like hungry wolves. Each napkin, each scrap of paper bearing Lieutenant Hayes's calculations, was carefully photographed and analyzed. Modern computing power began unlocking patterns that had waited decades to be discovered. Outside, the crowd had grown. Local fishermen brought out old maps, sharing stories passed down about strange sonar readings and areas where nets mysteriously snagged. News crews set up permanent positions, broadcasting updates about the mysterious military operation centered on a small-town cafe. Jessica Parker, the realtor, sat in stunned silence as her carefully planned waterfront development scheme unraveled. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from the development company, demanding explanations for the sudden military presence. Mrs. Sullivan, she said finally, I think we need to revisit the terms of dash. Not now, Marie cut her off, carrying fresh coffee to the naval team. History's being made here, young lady. Property values can wait. At 1,400 hours, the first breakthrough came. Martinez's team had overlaid Hayes's napkin calculations with modern satellite data. "Captain," she called out, "we've got it." The triangle points to a deep water trench 50 miles offshore. Sonar's picking up definite anomalies. Hayes immediately began issuing orders into a secure radio. "Pacific Command, this is Operation Legacy. We have confirmed coordinates. Request immediate asset deployment to Sector 793. Marie watched as the cafe's vintage radio, mounted behind the counter since the 1940s, suddenly crackled to life. Through some quirk of electronics, or perhaps something more mysterious, it began picking up naval communications. Copy Operation Legacy. Carrier Strike Group 3 responding. ETA to Port Haven Waters, 3 hours. The cafe's customers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Carrier Strike Group 3 meant the USS Abraham Lincoln was headed their way, along with its full complement of support vessels. "There's more," Martinez announced, studying the photograph through a specialized scanner. "The submarine in the photo, its shadow falls at an impossible angle. Your grandfather deliberately positioned his crew for that shot, knowing the sun's position would create a shadow pointing to a second location," Hayes breathed. "He didn't just find the Japanese fleet. He found something else." Marie's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee pot. "The missionary boat," she said quietly. "The civilians he saved. That was no accident, was it?" Hayes shook his head. "According to records, my grandfather diverted from his patrol route to rescue that boat. Official report says he spotted it by chance. But if these calculations are right..." "He knew it would be there," Martinez finished. "Because he'd found something bigger. Something that made him change everything about his mission." The cafe's vintage radio crackled again. "Operation Legacy, be advised. Chinese vessels detected moving toward target coordinates. They've broken our codes. They know what we're looking for." The atmosphere in Harbor Light shifted instantly. What had been an historical treasure hunt suddenly felt like a race against time. Hayes began coordinating with Pacific Command, organizing a response to the Chinese presence. More naval personnel arrived, including a team of senior officers who established a tactical center in what had been Marie's storage room. The development company's deadline for closing the cafe seemed like a distant memory as Harbor Light became the focal point of an international maritime operation. Local fishing boats reported unusual activity on the horizon, dark shapes moving through distant waters, helicopter rotors heard over the waves. Port Haven was witnessing something unprecedented, all because Marie Sullivan had refused to take down an old photograph. "Your father," Hayes said to Marie during a quiet moment, "he protected this secret for decades. Kept my grandfather's legacy safe until we were ready to understand it." Marie touched the photograph's frame gently. "Dad always said some things are worth more than money. Worth more than progress or development or changing times. Some things need to be preserved because they're part of who we are." As afternoon light slanted through the cafe windows, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The napkin calculations revealed not just coordinates but a complex system of tide tables, lunar phases, and underwater currents. Lieutenant Hayes hadn't just stumbled upon sunken treasure. He discovered a key to understanding the entire Pacific theater of World War II. "The missionary boat," Martinez explained, studying the data, "it was carrying more than civilians. According to these notes, it had proof of something huge. Something that could have changed everything if it had come to light in 1944. The vintage radio suddenly broadcast a new message: "All units, be advised. Chinese vessels have launched submersibles. They're diving on the primary target zone." Hayes's expression hardened. "How long until the Lincoln arrives?" 90 minutes, sir. But the Chinese will reach the site first." The cafe fell silent as the implications sank in. Decades of secret history, preserved in a simple photograph, now threatened to fall into foreign hands. The race wasn't just for sunken gold anymore, it was for something far more valuable: truth. As tension mounted in Harbor Light Cafe, none of them could know that high above, Satellite images were tracking an unprecedented movement of naval forces converging on their small town. By sunset, Port Haven's peaceful harbor would become the gathering point for one of the largest shows of American naval power since World War II. And it all started because Marie Sullivan understood something the developers and bankers never could, that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in the secrets they keep and the truths they protect until the right moment arrives to change everything. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came when the fishing boats returned early, their captains reporting a sight none had ever witnessed: the massive silhouette of the USS Abraham Lincoln appearing through the afternoon haze, its escort vessels spread across the horizon like a steel armada from another age. Inside Harbor Light Cafe, Captain Hayes received the message everyone had been dreading: Chinese submersibles have reached the primary target. They're attempting to access the wreck. But then Lieutenant Martinez made a discovery that changed everything. Studying the vintage photograph through specialized equipment, she found microscopic scratches on the original negative, deliberate marks that had been invisible for decades. "Captain," she called out, her voice tight with excitement, "your grandfather left us more than coordinates. He left us a warning. The Japanese ships we're seeing, they're decoys." The cafe fell silent as Martinez explained. The real treasure isn't where the obvious clues point. Lieutenant Hayes used the Chinese codebreakers' own assumptions against them. Even back then, he knew someday someone would try to find what he'd discovered. Hayes studied the new data with growing amazement. He positioned his crew to create a false pattern: the real coordinates. He double-checked the calculations. They're 3 miles east of where the Chinese are looking. The vintage radio crackled with urgent updates. The Abraham Lincoln's battle group was moving into position. Helicopters launched from its deck, and deep beneath the waves, American submarines silently maneuvered to protect something far more valuable than sunken gold. Marie Sullivan stood behind her counter, watching history unfold in her cafe. The development company's deadline had passed unnoticed hours ago. Jessica Parker, the realtor, sat in stunned silence as her phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages from her bosses. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jessica said finally, "I think I understand now why you wouldn't take down that photograph." Marie smiled. "Some things are worth more than money, dear. Some things are worth waiting decades to protect." At that moment, the cafe's door opened to admit an elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a naval officer wearing admiral stars. The room snapped to attention. "At ease," Admiral James Cooper commanded. "I came as soon as I heard what you'd found." He wheeled himself to the photograph, studying it with knowing eyes. "I was there that day. Junior officer on Hayes's boat. Never knew what he'd really photographed until now." Captain Hayes knelt beside the Admiral's wheelchair. "Sir, you knew my grandfather?" "Knew him. Son, I helped him set up that shot. We all did. The whole crew understood we were part of something bigger than ourselves. But Hayes was the only one who knew the whole truth." Admiral Cooper pointed to the missionary boat visible in the photograph's background. That wasn't just any civilian vessel. It was carrying evidence of a secret Japanese research program. Something both sides wanted buried after the war. Hayes found it, photographed it, then made sure it stayed hidden until America might need it again. Martinez's computer beeped with urgent data. "Sir, we're getting sonar images from the real location. There's definitely something down there, but it's not just submarines." The Admiral nodded. "No, it wouldn't be. The gold was never the real treasure. What Hayes found was proof of scientific breakthroughs years ahead of their time. Research that could change everything, if it falls into the right hands." Outside, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple, silhouetting the massive warships now visible from Port Haven's shore. The whole town had gathered along the waterfront, watching in awe as history literally rose from the waves before them. The vintage radio suddenly carried a new voice, the Lincoln's commander: "Chinese vessels are withdrawing. I repeat, they've taken the bait. The real target is secure." A cheer went up in the cafe. But Admiral Cooper raised his hand for silence. "That's not the only victory today. Hayes didn't just hide military secrets in this photograph. He hid something else, something meant specifically for this town." He produced an envelope, yellowed with age. "His last letter to me, to be opened when the truth finally came out. Read it, Mrs. Sullivan." Marie's hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper. To the people of Port Haven, the treasure I found isn't just gold or military secrets. It's proof of what small towns and ordinary people can do when history calls. The missionary boat we saved? It carried scientists who would later help America win the space race. The coordinates hidden in this photo? They mark a place where everyday heroes proved that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. I chose your cafe to guard this secret because I knew Port Haven would understand. Some things are worth protecting, worth waiting for, worth more than any developer's dollars. When this letter is read, the Navy will have found what I hid. But the real treasure was never underwater. It was in the heart of a town that kept faith with history, that understood why some photographs can't be taken down, why some stories need to wait for the right moment to be told. The deed in this envelope transfers ownership of several key waterfront properties to the Port Haven Historical Trust. Use them wisely. Your town didn't just protect a photograph, it protected a piece of America's soul. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes. As Marie finished reading, Admiral Cooper added, "Those properties include everything the development company was trying to buy. Hayes bought them quietly over years, set up the trust, waited for this day." Jessica Parker's phone slipped from nerveless fingers. The development scheme that had threatened to erase Port Haven's character was dead before it began. Captain Hayes stood at attention. "Admiral, what happens now?" "Now." Cooper smiled. "Now Port Haven becomes a different kind of port. One where history is preserved, where naval vessels will dock regularly, where the story of a photograph that saved both a town and a nation's secrets will be properly told." As if to punctuate his words, a formation of Navy jets roared overhead, their wings catching the last rays of sunset. Below them, the Abraham Lincoln stood proud against the darkening sky, its presence a testament to the power of patience, preservation, and the understanding that some treasures are worth protecting at any cost. Marie Sullivan looked around her cafe, at the naval officers still analyzing data, at her regular customers who had witnessed history being made, at the photograph that had started it all. "I guess we'll need more coffee," she said simply. "Seems like Harbor Light has some new regular customers." The development company's deadline had passed unnoticed, rendered meaningless by forces larger than business plans and property values. Port Haven had found something more valuable than modernization. It had rediscovered its purpose. In the days that followed, the town transformed. The Navy established a permanent historical research center. The cafe became a registered historical landmark. Tourist boats offered tours past the spot where aircraft carriers had appeared on the horizon like ghosts from another era. But through it all, Harbor Light Cafe remained unchanged, still serving coffee to locals and sailors alike, still protecting its precious photograph, still reminding visitors that sometimes the greatest treasures are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to change everything. And in the end, Marie Sullivan understood better than anyone, some photographs aren't just images frozen in time. They're bridges between past and present, between ordinary moments and extraordinary revelations, between a small town's struggle to survive and a nation's need to remember that its greatest secrets are often kept not in vaults or databases, but in the hearts of people who understand that some things are worth saving, no matter the cost. The aircraft carriers eventually departed, but their presence had marked Port Haven forever. The town that developers had written off as dying became a living museum, a place where military history breathed, where everyday people had proved that sometimes the simplest acts, like refusing to take down an old photograph, could change not just a town's fate, but a nation's understanding of its own history. And behind the counter at Harbor Light Cafe, Marie Sullivan still serves coffee, still tells the story to anyone who asks about the photograph on her wall, the image that saved not just 30 lives in the Pacific, but an entire town's soul, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't what we find beneath the waves, but what we protect above them. In the quiet dignity of places where history and hope meet over a cup of coffee and the understanding that some things are worth waiting decades to preserve. Thanks for watching. See you again in the next video. Stay stunned.